Well, good morning and welcome to the University of Minnesota's Invasive Species Conference. I'm Vince Fritz, Professor of Horticultural Science and Extension Specialist in the College of Food, Agricultural, and Natural Resource Sciences, lead coordinator and your host of today's event. We're happy to share the day with you as we talk about and later this afternoon experience some of the most serious threats to Minnesota's ecosystems, invasive species. Briefly, the objectives of the conference are to improve your understanding of what makes a species invasive and the factors that affect that invasiveness, what data and information is most critical to our understanding of invasive species, so that effective mitigation strategies can be designed and tested, and lastly, how does data inform us about our relative successes in our efforts to mitigate how citizen science networks have played a key role and how you as a volunteer can be part of those efforts. So this morning, you'll first hear from some of our key partners at the university and learn about the roles that they play in leading and supporting invasive species research and education. The Minnesota Invasive Terrestrial Plants and Pest Center, the Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center, and the University of Minnesota Extension. We will then hear from three presenters who've been actively involved in research and outreach education in invasive species for some time, who we think will bring a unique perspective to the control of invasive species in Minnesota. During each presentation, I'll be monitoring the Q&A function found at the bottom bar of your screen, and will pose questions to each speaker at the end of their presentations. Please write your questions here in the Q&A section. And if you see a question that's already posted, but you'd like that question answered as well, please give it a thumbs up to indicate that, and we'll prioritize those questions. We'll not be using the chat feature for today's event. In the event that I'm not able to get to all the questions for each presenter due to time constraints, we'll post the answers at a later date and keep you all posted as to how you can access them. Later this afternoon, you'll have an opportunity to learn about invasive species most important where you live, hosted by a local expert at one of our several research and outreach centers located throughout the state. We hope you enjoy this unique part of the conference and learn more about how you can be part of the collective efforts on invasive species research and education. And just as a reminder, all sessions in the afternoon will begin at 1 p.m. at those respective centers. So I think that all the things that we wanted to cover at the very beginning about housekeeping items and how the day would unfold for all of you. I'd like to move into introducing our first presenter and partner in this event, Dr. Rob Burnett. Rob Burnett is the director of the Minnesota Invasive Terrestrial Plants and Pest Center. He's also a research biologist with the U.S. Forest Service and adjunct faculty member in the Department of Entomology at the university. Good morning, Rob.
Good morning, Eli. Just got one small technical issue as we try to get into the full screen view. Of course, I can't get rid of this little, there we go. Great. Thanks, Vince. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. Again, I'm Rob Burnett, and I am the director of the Minnesota Invasive Terrestrial Plants and Pests Center, which is a little bit of a mouthful. So on campus, we call it MITPPC at the University of Minnesota. And I'm really excited to have a chance to say a few words about MITPPC and the work that the center does and how it relates to today's events. I don't think that I need to convince anyone here that invasive species are one of the greatest threats to the waters and plants of the state. However, as you likely already know, managing harmful non-native species isn't easy. And so there are many people who would like better tools and techniques to deal with the new weeds, insects, worms, diseases of concern. And so there are plenty of opportunities for research. So MITPPC was created at the university in 2014 for a very practical purpose. specifically to lead science that will prevent and minimize threats from terrestrial invasive species to the prairies, forests, wetlands, and agricultural resources of the state. So MITPPC is specifically tasked with identifying which invasive species potentially are most problematic to the lands of the state, driving applied research to address those species, and then sharing findings very widely. We're grateful, extremely grateful, to the Legislative Citizen Commission on Minnesota Resources and the Minnesota Legislature for their continued funding of the center through the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund. We've been fortunate to support 42 different research projects on some of the worst terrestrial invasive species like emerald ash borer, buckthorn, Palmer amaranth, and oak wilt, among many others. Now, our research projects involve over 96 researchers, drawing on the diverse strengths and talents of the faculty throughout the entire university system. We're also preparing a new generation of scientists to tackle the complex problem of invasive species with some non-traditional thinking. Now, our teams also include 52 external partners who have played an active role both in the design and the completion of the research, and they are also eager to begin to apply project results. Lastly, the work of the center has resulted in 70 peer-reviewed publications. Now, these publications represent an academic seal of approval on the quality of the research, but for MITPPC, the publications aren't the end of the road. Our goal is to see the results of this research put to good use. So MITPPC is nationally unique. No other state is investing in terrestrial invasive species research the way Minnesota is. And I'm very pleased that you will all have an opportunity this morning to hear from Drs. Rebecca Montgomery, Roger Becker, and Dan Larkin, each of whom has led a research project for MITPPC, although I think Dan will be talking about his work on aquatic invasives. They're each a national leader in invasive species research, and we're extremely fortunate to have them at the university. We're also lucky to have partners in state and federal agencies, tribes, nonprofits, industry, extension, and with other individuals like you. These partnerships help to ensure that regionally and nationally significant make a difference on the ground in Minnesota. Feedback from our partners is also fueling exciting new research questions, so it creates a very exciting feedback loop. So please take some time to learn a little bit more about MITPPC by visiting our website, following us on Twitter, or signing up for our newsletter. If you have more questions, feel free to contact me directly. So thanks for your interest, learning more about invasive species, and perhaps engaging more with the center in the future. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the day's events. Thanks.
Thank you, Rob. Appreciate it. So our next partner that I'd like to introduce is Dr. Nick Phelps. And Dr. Phelps is the director of the Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center, an associate professor in the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology. Hi, Nick.
Good morning, Fritz, and hello, everybody. First, I'd like to thank the organizers of this event. It's a pretty incredible group of people that put this together and brought you all here from across the state, and thanks for participating. As Rob mentioned, and as you all likely know since you're participating today, the impacts of invasive species here in Minnesota are real, and they are growing. In the aquatic realm, there's far too much on the line in Minnesota to rely on the same approaches that were available when these species arrived. It's important that we conduct innovative research to find solutions, and we need to build capacity at statewide and local levels to address these problems. To that end, 10 years ago, Minnesota took a leadership role and created a first of its kind program called the Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center. With the support from the University of Minnesota, the Minnesota Legislature, and the Minnesota Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund. You can think of us like a sister program to MITPPC that Rob was just talking about. Briefly stated, our mission here is to develop science-based solutions to our AIS problems in the state and to inspire action by others. Right now, we have about 40 PhD level scientists and 19 absolutely incredible graduate students working with MAISRC on a range of topics, including zebra mussels, starry stonewort, the invasive common and big-headed carps, Eurasian water milfoil, and many more species that threaten our state. We also have an amazing partnership with University of Minnesota Extension to host the award-winning citizen science program, AIS Detectors, that you'll hear a bit about coming up. We've made a lot of progress on many fronts over the last 10 years, and I don't have time to go into all those details, but I can tell you that it gives me great hope to see the impact of our research, the impact that's already happening from the state capitol to the end of your docks in every corner of the state. We're really excited to share updates on our research and outreach efforts with you today. I'm here in the virtual format and then in the field locations across the state. But if you're interested in learning more after today, I encourage you to visit our website, which I'll drop in the chat box here in just a minute. I highly encourage you to become an AIS detector and participate in the citizen science program, or you can reach out to me directly or anybody here at MAISRC to find out more about what we do and how you can become engaged with our work. Thanks again, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you very much, Nick. Appreciate that. Our final partner that I'd like to introduce to all of you this morning is Angela Gupta. Angela is a University of Minnesota Extension professor and forester. Extension has long been a leader in translating research-based information into problem-solving action that delivers impact through its programs. And I think this morning, Angie will share with you some of these programs and how they present opportunities for you to be part of a much bigger effort in preventing the spread of invasive species. Angie?
Great. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me. And I'm optimistic you can see my slide. It's fairly busy. It's a timetable of activities. And I'll just say that University of Minnesota Extension has been doing invasive species program and community and participatory science since 2008, so a long time. And this first slide is meant to be a timetable. So we started this work way back in 2008 with emerald ash borer, using volunteers to do early detection and rapid response. And it worked so well, we added additional insects and then plants, because we realized, why weren't we doing plants? And then we really started engaged master volunteers like master naturalists in invasive species management leadership. So training them to take other volunteers, 4-H groups, church and community groups out into the environment to do things like buckthorn busting and garlic mustard removal. And so all of these projects that I'll mention on this slide continue today in some iteration. This is just meant to be sort of how they began and what we've been doing. We enabled forest pest first detectors and others to do oriental bittersweet surveys, ash surveys, research, and emerald ash borer work. And then we also started using volunteers to do biosurveillance, so in native insects to look for emerald ash borer, an invasive insect, with our Wasp Watchers program. In 2017, that Forest Pest First Detector program was part of the inspiration that resulted in the AIS, the Aquatic Invasive Species Detector program you just heard Nick talk about. We've also added more plants as new species have emerged. In addition, we've done a great deal of work in new tools and platforms, including online cloud-based platforms for managers like ISM Track, and a lot of new technologies, including unmanned aerial vehicles, think drones, how do we deploy those for invasive species management work, and then 3D printing models of invasive species augmented in virtual reality. So we've really had a long history of working with invasive species across platforms and audiences to make a difference. This triangle at the bottom is meant to sort of represent the state as a whole and invasive species, from early detections like forest pest first detectors to a program that really are working with long-term management of very endemic invasive species like buckthorn, honeysuckle, and garlic mustard, and then that space all in between. So as you saw in that last timeline, that timeline ended in 2018, not because the work stopped, because I ran out of room on my slide. Some new and really innovative programs have started during the pandemic. So these are a mix of programs that started from 2020 and continuing now until 2022, varying iterations. But this triangle is really meant to be the idea of we can really engage community members through things like crowdsourcing. So really simple, using online tools, free smartphone apps to answer important invasive species questions, to things that take a keener eye and a bit more online learning, to things that are really repeat actions and participatory science. And we've proven that we can do that and answer some really tricky invasive species questions fairly quickly in a variety of different ways, engaging different audience members. And so I will just close with this thought. I think there's immense potential to engage community members to help answer diverse and complex natural resource questions. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share what Extension has done with invasive species management. So with that, I will turn it back over to the organizers and field any questions in the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angie. Appreciate that. We are now at a point where I'd like to introduce our first keynote speaker for this morning, Dr. Roger Becker. Roger is a professor and extension agronomist in the Department of Agronomy and Plant Genetics. Dr. Becker's research focuses on weed management in annual and perennial systems in both croplands and natural areas. Current projects include management of invasive species with expanded efforts on Canada thistle and garlic mustard, weed management and production systems, and studying the environmental impacts of herbicide and non-herbicide weed management systems. Good morning, Roger.
Good morning. We'll see if this works. Hello. There. Do you see the slides, folks?
I think I can see it, Roger.
Okay, good. So I'm Roger Becker. As Vince says, I do a lot of stuff, and I'm very applied. I'm an extension appointment. I'm a weeds scientist. So, and we call them weeds. And that's a profession, a society, it's a discipline within like pathology and entomology. But one thing I have done is, because I do a lot of different things, I've worked in a lot of natural native systems. I've worked in a lot of cropping systems and everything in between. And one thing you do start to realize, there's a lot of commonality that goes across all those systems, and things that we try to deal with and manage for invasive species. There's common themes that underlie all of that. So there's a whole host of people I've worked with over the years that have influenced and are a part of the slides that we'll go through. There we go. It's just laggy. But the thing I'm going to do is give you a general overview of what are invasive species and how do we think about them. And then Dan and Rebecca will follow up with more details of how you might collect data, do things for management and so forth. But the general overview is, and mine is somewhat weed focused because I'm a weed scientist, but you could just insert the word invasive species in there. But what is an invasive plant? Oh, the word weed has been used for centuries, and and we even have a society that calls ourselves weed rather than invasive plant science. But we do have an invasive journal. The common concept, though, has evolved over the years, and there's different terminology that has evolved, and I'll get into a few of those points. You don't need to know or regurgitate all the details, but it gives you a perspective of why things might be as they are when you hear different people saying different things about plants. For us, the old-time farmer types, weed is a plant out of place. For urbanites, etc., a plant out of place is a weed. A species out of place could be a problem. Of that, alien plants are introduced or exotic species that come from somewhere else. They're not native to the area or the habitat that you're in. And there's a thing called casual alien plants or introduced plants. Casual means they simply have shown up, you spot them, somebody detects them, but they don't necessarily reproduce and survive and maintain a presence. You'll hear the term naturalized species often, and that is an introduced exotic or alien plant that can reproduce And it does sustain itself in the area or habitat that is newly introduced to, but it does not spread long distances and expand populations to cause big problems. A subset of that is what we're talking about today, the invasive species, invasive plants. Invasive species plants are naturalized plants that can reproduce and spread considerable distances. So in addition to being naturalized, they start to cause problems. They start to entrench themselves, have very large populations, and start to impact the habitat and the ecosystems around them. In some respects, they can be transformers, where they transform the habitat and change the conditions and the form and nature of the ecosystems that they are in. This is another more simple way of looking at that same concept. The whole slide is species that are present where you are. The non-native is a subset of that. And of the non-native, there are a subset of those that are naturalized or that do tend to stay put and show up from year to year. And an even smaller subset of that are what we call the invasive species, or the ones that truly cause problems and do things that we do not want them to do and try to manage. A thing came along in the late 90s, 1999. Bill Clinton has an executive order that defined invasive species. And in part that was due to a concerted effort in the 90s to increase public awareness and develop funding sources and management approaches that are beyond local individual efforts on invasive species. To have a presence, if you will. And part of that at the federal level, to have a presence, you need to have a name that's understood. And that definition of invasive species is such as a species that is non-native to the ecosystem under consideration, meaning is introduced. And it's a species whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic environmental harm or harm to human health. So that's good. And a lot of that helped us get funding and define resources and help move things forward to do very important research on invasive species and public education and outreach. But for us in agriculture in particular, the word native starts to cause some confusion. So what is a native species? And a native species depends on the context of how you look at it. In things I work with all these different groups, but at the very top, you'll see the most localized focused definition or use of the term native. The very bottom is the most broad, least localized. And for Minnesota, the Minnesota statute 84D does state that a species naturally present reproducing within a state or that naturally expands from this historic range into the state is a native species. So something we talk about in our invasive plants group would be black locust, is slowly moving north as global warming proceeds, and it has a better chance of having a sustained population as it moves north. You could argue maybe 50 or 100 years down the road, it'll be in southern Minnesota, and it is native to states further south. It might be termed a native plant. The executive order that Bill Clinton signed is the next. With respect to an ecosystem, a species that, except for an introduction, historically or currently occurs in that ecosystem. So a native is something that is not introduced on the executive order at the federal level. The Minnesota Native Plant Working Group is the next bullet. Is a native as a plant, one that is present in a defined area prior to European settlement. So that sets a defined historical time mark for things that are native and things that aren't native. What was here in Minnesota, for example, when all of our ancestors, for us that are European descent, came in and started settling the land. Last, at the very bottom, is something I deal with on the things I do for biological control. Biocontrol is the introduction of an agent to control a pest that is introduced. And in the sense of biocontrol agents, what is considered native when you do host specificity testing is, in the world of weeds, is currently anything in the continental United States. So that's very broad. And more broadly, then we work with Canada and Mexico. So anything that is present and native, not an introduced species in North America. So when I think in my biocontrol circles, when I say the word native, it means something very different than when I'm sitting with our Minnesota Department of Ag and DNR colleagues, for example, discussing what is native to Minnesota. So native has different contexts, and if you carry it to the extreme limits, I mean, there are historical limits. If you look at the dinosaurs were here at one point, marine life was here at one point. Things were here before the glaciers ground over Minnesota and receded. So at a point in time is when you start to think things are native. So it depends on your framework. Well, what about native plants? Can they be a problem? Sometimes they can. Overabundant and active in agriculture in particular, a lot of our biggest weed problems are natives. So in a sense of needing to have a non-native species to get funding for, sometimes that was an issue as things evolved over the years. When you see natives becoming a problem, often it's associated with a change in disturbance regime in the community. The picture at the lower left is that first example. When you look at woody species, box elder, aspen, cottonwood, Siberian elm is really starting to make a presence and a move in Minnesota. In CRP, prairies, non-managed areas, other habitats, woodies can be a big problem. We're the interface of the tall mesic prairie and hardwood forest and the boreal forest system. So that interface is in that picture. You see it's a fish and wildlife waterfowl management area that is a tall mesic prairie, but is being invaded by aspen. Colonial populations of aspen are moving in just south of Annandale in Minnesota. My predecessor, Ollie Strand, dealt with a thing called prickly ash, which is native in Minnesota, but it can be a big problem in pastures. Agriculturally, we've really evolved through the things that the corn, soybean, small grains folks have been doing that have driven us to having some of our biggest weed problems as being natives, the ragweeds in particular, and the pigweeds, palmer and water hemp are big problems. For the sake of time, we won't be able to get into it in detail, but we, based on my colleague Neil Anderson's work, reed canary grass has always been debated, introduced or not, forage grasses that are introduced versus native origin. And in fact, it looks like a lot of our reed canary grass is in fact native to Minnesota, but reed canary grass is really problematic, regardless of whether you deem it native or not. Like wetlands where you have inundative, it's a watershed holding pond in many cases, unfortunately. So you get really hydrological extremes and you get a lot of nutrient loading. And in cases like that, reed canary grass can become a dominant thing that really changes an ecosystem that would rather have something else or more diversity in. So what makes a plant invasive? This is a big point of research over the years and decades, really. Agriculture and horticultural industries and the ornamental industries have a lot of species that they'd like to bring in. There are a lot of trade in the aquarium and aquatic situations as well. If you're going to bring a species to the country purposefully, can we guess whether that's going to be a problem or not? And really, unfortunately, we've had relatively moderate success on trying to presuppose or pre-predict what's going to be a problem. But there are some common traits of invasive species that are kind of universally truisms, if you will. Invasive species tend to be very competitive. They grow very fast, produce lots of seeds or propagules or offspring. They tolerate management, whatever the management regimes are for the area that they are introduced to. They have a tolerance or a way to adapt and exist in that system. They can grow under a wide range of conditions. A lot of the worst invasive species and plants tend to have a lot of elasticity, or meaning they have a genetic base that allows them broad diversity and ability to adapt to things that change. And lastly, seeds or propagules that last a long time. You get like garlic mustard we have in Minnesota. You might have buckthorn come in and displace garlic mustard. You go back 10, 15, 20 years later and take out the buckthorn to try to renovate it. And those seeds have survived at some level and you have a reoccurrence of that pest. But they need to have that long-term time frame to be able to persist over time when things aren't going so well for the invasive. So those are the traits that tend to make plants and species in general invasive. Well, so what if we do have invasives? Is that a problem? Pimental has done this ever since I've been in the business, and the last I could find was quoted to pimental, and it was 2009, stating 50,000 species of plants, animals, microbes have been introduced into the U.S. at that time, and those introductions caused more extinction of native species than most any other threats. And it caused more than 100 billion in damages and control costs each year nationally. And more recently, if you look in the literature and try to find references, you tend to see 135 to 150 billion per year quoted as the cost of having these invasive species doing what they do. So why do we have the invasive species? For those of you in biocontrol, you understand that lower left image is what we look at historically for looking at biocontrol agents. And how do you select and test for specificity? You start in the center with the species, then you broaden out to the genus, broader family, then families of economic importance and unrelated plants. That whole purpose is to really look at the things most closely related. And over the years, it got to trying to talk to people about, well, garlic mustard, for example, is it a passenger or a driver? Is it causing the problems or just there because we have other problems? And it came to the realization, and many have characterized this, but I use this model in the red of why we have some significant issues. For garlic mustard, people talk about worms chewing up the litter and causing openness so garlic mustard can come in. And we have the worms because we have deer. Too many deer, they're chewing up all the other vegetation and there's a deer-worm interaction going on. People debate about that, but there's interactions going on there. Overarching that, we have the deer because of the habitats that have changed. You don't have the predators. We have urban areas with a lot of deer. There's just reasons that support those high deer populations. And we have the habitats that are being modified, overarching all of that, with significant climate change things starting to impact Minnesota and the more northern states in particular. And the revelation to me, working in natural and non-natural managed systems, is that everything seems to be disturbed to a point. And as people, there is so much impact of having the people on the planet doing the things that we do, that there's a lot of disturbance and change going on that helps set the pace for these invasions of invasive species that can be quite problematic. So we're in a disturbed system. Part of that disturbance is starting to show itself as far as climate change. It's been discussed for a long time now, but we're really seeing things come to fruition. In Minnesota, our precipitation patterns have changed dramatically. We have very wet Junes. It's a demonstrable difference in past history. Also, we have localized extremely heavy rainfall and localized extreme lack of rainfall. So we have droughts, and in general, we're proposed to be more like Kansas down the road. In 50 to 100 years, we'll be more like possibly Kansas. It could be Illinois, but I think we're going to be drier and warmer as climate change starts to impact us. And as that happens, species are going to behave very differently. Work that was supported by MITPPC, looking at predictions of things moving or changing as we have climate change. In Dave Muller's lab, Briscoe Runquist et al. Had this paper for us in ag, looking at Palmer amaranth, showing the expansion and northward movement of and more suitable habitats for Palmer amaranth with time. And Palmer is one of those that we try to exclude so far because we don't have a lot of propagules in Minnesota to date, and there is an active eradication program. But you can look at a lot of different species, and there's a lot of predictions going on of trying to show where these things might be in the future. Another one we have to look out for is Johnson grass with rhizomes surviving, maybe 50, maybe 100. Different people have different views on that down the road. But a whole bunch of things are going to change for all organisms as we get into that climate change. And an overarching principle would be what do we do? The first thing you should do on the far left, this is a typical sigmoidal curve showing an expansion of a population that's introduced over time. As you move from left to right, you see that red dotted line where the population explodes and then reaches some level where it tends to exist or fluctuate around a fairly high population that is causing problems. A lot of effort has been put in prevention at the very beginning when the thing is introduced, and early detection, rapid response, which is what a lot of you folks on this seminar today are the eyes on the ground that can help make those things happen. With early detection with Palmer amaranth, for example, it is an eradicate species. We're not under the illusion that it will be kept out of Minnesota forever, but the longer we can keep it out, the better. And right now we're in that phase with early detection and that introduction phase of Palmer amaranth, for example, moving into the state and going after those populations and preventing seed production. But it's very easy at the beginning. There's often failures at the beginning, but that is the key spot where things can be done much more economically and much more efficiently. Just a few closing comments. We tend to think of invasive species from those Eurasians because of our ancestral movement and settling of the Midwest. But it goes the other way as well. And a real eye-opener was in the 2000s when we started to have our common ragweed start to show up in Europe. And absent its native things that tend to keep the populations in check, Hungary became the epicenter of just amazingly high populations of amaranth, so high that their pollen counts were magnitudes of order higher than our highest counts in the US. And if they have people that suffer hay fever, that's a problem. It's a medical issue for them. So a lot of efforts have been spent looking at ways to do control, biocontrol, et cetera, on common ragweed. So it's a species that we have given to the other countries and is causing significant problems. So it's not always just things come here. I mean, globally, things are moving around everywhere. We give people a lot of our problems as well. Another thing that's really starting to expand in Europe is Solidago, the Canada goldenrod. It's a very common species and you don't really have to seed it. If you try to get a prairie going, you'll find it. In Europe, it's starting to do really significant introductions and invasion processes where it's causing some serious issues. Interestingly, because of the monarch interest here, milkweed is on the radar. It's not considered naturalized in that as an invasive, but it is naturalized and existing in populations like this that are pretty intense in many places. This happens to be in Croatia, where common milkweed is, we consider a very beneficial plant, but could be becoming a challenge for them. Flip side, just a couple comments. We think of natives. Natives are controlled with all the things that are there where they try to exist and they're not doing so well. And I looked all over some countries in Europe trying to find garlic mustard. And you saw a lot of this kind of thing where there's all sorts of non-specific things attacking them. It's really hard to find an individual native garlic mustard that had a lot of good seed set and so forth. Some areas it does cycle well, but it fits that classic concept that the native in his home range is kept at bay through several checks. Counter to that, though, we have, Angie knows about this one, poison hemlock is making its move in Minnesota, and it's already been doing such in Iowa and Missouri over the last decade. You're starting to see a lot of poison hemlock show up, which is an introduced species in Minnesota. It is native to Europe, however. That's what the green indicates in the map. And this was very common in Croatia and other areas in Europe. All the areas where you have water, this is a roadside ditch, so it has more moisture. It was amazing the levels of the native species just running amok in those habitats. So we tend to think it's a big problem if we see smaller populations than this in this native range. This is very common. And last, I'll close with Phragmites. I know Dan's doing some excellent work and others at MITPPC on Phragmites, the Austrias, the introduced species, is starting to do some serious, cause some serious concerns in Minnesota. But again, in Europe, you see a lot of these where it is native. Phragmites can be a very dominant species in its home range as well. And it's even more so than we see in some places here. This happens to be a UNESCO World Heritage Site where the Drava River meets the Danube between Serbia and Croatia and Hungary. A very large wetland area. And you see this Phragmites everywhere. it is the species you see on a lot of the thatch roofs there. The point being, natives can be misbehaving or very aggressive in their home states. They can be not so much or misbehaving in their introduced range. And there's a lot of diversity in those species, so it depends on the individual species. I won't go into this, but if we'll make these available later through those that are attending, but there's some interesting progression of reed canary grass as a native, non-native in the 30s. This was native in 29. And there's archival stuff about a kernel reed collected in the Wilhelmina Valley in Oregon, collected reed canary grass to do some improvements for pasture. There were introduced seeds as stocks from Germany as well, and Europe in general. So it's a mixed bag, but in a nutshell, it looks like most of the stuff we have in Minnesota probably is tending towards the native side, which is flips it on its head a bit about how we think about one of our biggest invasive species, but still a problem. And we'll close, these will be available, just a series of resources that people can see for NAISMA, MIPPPC, Midwest Invasive Plant Network. NAISMA is the National Invasive Species Network. MIPPPC is more regional in the Midwest for plants. MAISRC is our Minnesota Invasive Group, has a website. Department of Ag has a very good website for the noxious weed list and components of the weed regulatory things that we do in the state. And with that, I'll close. And if we have time for a couple questions.
Yes, thanks, Roger. There were a couple questions. First one is, was posted on Q&A, and others may also want to weigh in on the answer to this question as well. But the question is, white campion is a guilty pleasure for me. How does it harm my prairie areas?
White campion?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, white. It depends on the site, but that's another one that shows up in our, like the pasture grazing systems, the perennial systems. That whole group of white campion, white cockle, and some others can cycle in those systems, but I personally have not seen them become a problematic invasive. They need some disturbance where I've seen them but whoever's asking the question may have a different experience. I wouldn't see them invading a healthy prairie, prairie that after the prairie is well established and you have the right mix of species and occasional burning or other management to keep things like brome grass, et cetera, at bay. I don't see it being but I've always been proven wrong. If they have a site where it's out of control, it'd be of interest.
Sure.
To me, it'd be more of a curiosity plan.
Yeah. Angie, I'll just call on you for a brief second. Would you like to add anything more to that question regarding white campion?
No, thank you. I dropped the link in the chat. I'm good, thanks.
Okay, thank you. One other question, Roger, is I don't know if I'm speaking for a lot of folks or not, but it's very disturbing to learn that we oftentimes live in disturbed environments. I guess one of the questions I have is regarding your example of garlic mustard and the whole deer worm dynamic going on there and how it impacts that plant's relative invasiveness. And I'm thinking about urban settings where deer populations often are on the rise and coyote populations are on the decline because of the concern over the threat to small people and pets. So I guess my question is regarding that particular plant and that particular dynamic, is there hope for us to be able to establish a meaningful and impactful management plan to mitigate the spread of garlic mustard?
That's a good question. We have been working on biocontrol, but we have been working on biocontrol since 1998 on that, and we still have things. There are a couple of insects that look good, and biocontrol isn't always a magic bullet, but I think there's some very post-specific to weevils that could be very helpful in this regard. Absent that might be a couple of years or even longer down the road. One of them has been released in Canada already. So for us in the Midwest, wait, I'll retire, I'll sit on my deck and just wait for it to move down and we'll watch as things unfold. regardless, in the meantime, the here and now, it's amazing. Garlic mustard seed banks are an intriguing thing to me, how they get dispersed on the landscape. They don't fly in the air. They do move with, rainfall erosion down slope. They do maybe get hung up on animals, but they don't attach themselves to animals. They might be collected by rodents and things and moved around, but that's fairly short distances. But it is impressive on the seed banks that garlic mustard has. Quite a few renovations are going on in places that we started monitoring 20 years ago. And they've gone through various cycles of getting dense undergrowth that excluded garlic mustard. You open it up to renovate it and boom, it's there. So I think it can be a concern in the renovation phase where if you're trying to seed susceptible plants from transplants as small plants or seedlings in the renovation, it maybe compete with those and cause problems. And I see hand roguing going on in the metro area, but I don't have any magic bullets for them, unfortunately, at the moment. And whoever is interested could contact me. We can go into more management detail, or Angie or others might have more boots on the ground details.
Thank you very much, Roger. At the current time, I don't see any other questions in the Q&A. So at this point, I'll thank Roger for his presentation this morning, and we'll move on to our next keynote speaker this morning, Dr. Daniel Larkin. Dr. Larkin and his team work on applied problems in ecological restoration and invasive plant management in lake, wetland, and terrestrial habitats. Their goal is to conduct research that helps advance restoration of degraded habitats. In the human-dominated landscapes of the upper Midwest, effective prevention and control of biological invasions is an essential component of their work. Nearly all of his research projects involve research management collaborations and forms the basis for developing extension programs to translate that science into practical solutions on the ground and on the water. Good morning, Dan.
Good morning, Vince. And thank you to you and the other organizers for inviting me to speak today. I'm really enjoying it. And thank you, Roger, for a great setup for some of the things I'll be talking about. Vince asked me to talk about using data related to aquatic invasive species. So that's what I'll be focusing on, both in research and at the end in extension context. I want to start off by acknowledging the organizations and funding sources that made this work possible. Particularly MAISRC, you heard from Director Nick Phelps earlier, and University of Minnesota Extension, and our funding sources from the state and federal levels. And I especially want to acknowledge the people who are behind the work that I'll be talking about today. My colleagues here, Mike Verhoeven is wrapping up his PhD in my lab, Ranjan Krishnan, who did a postdoc with me. My AIS extension colleagues, Megan Weber and Pat Mulcahy, and Wes Glisson, who was a researcher in my lab. So I'm going to be talking about aquatic plant communities, and I think they're sort of a underappreciated, under-considered ecological community that we're rich in the state of Minnesota. Paul Skowinski from University of Wisconsin Extension has described them as our underwater forests, and I really like that terminology. They provide tremendous benefits to water quality, habitat for fish and other wildlife, and biodiversity. But unfortunately, there are several threats to our aquatic plant communities, notably eutrophication or excess nutrients that tend to degrade water clarity and favor kind of the pea soup algae dominated state. And we have loss of plants with that. Climate change is sort of a game changer for everything, including our aquatic vegetation. And then invasive species play a large role, both animals as well as aquatic invasive plants, which is a major focus for my research group. So probably a lot of you out there have seen this type of state where we have invasive species dominance. In this case, it's Eurasian water milfoil that's reached the surface and matted out and become a nuisance. And when that happens, there's interference with recreation. There are economic impacts, including to property values. There's an alteration of habitat. And something that we focus on is the potential for displacement of native plant species. So Roger brought up this idea of drivers or passengers. So when we think about invasive species, that same pattern of invasive species dominance, like we saw with the Eurasian water milfoil, can have different underlying causes. So we often think of invasive species as drivers that are causing direct loss of native species through competitive superiority. But we also recognize that they can be opportunists that thrive in a disturbed landscape and have done well under anthropogenic change. So, I think a nice example of this is dandelions, which, can become really abundant. But if you go out to a prairie, you're not going to see dandelions take over. And I could spend the next 20 years removing dandelions from my lawn and a prairie won't show up. It's not dandelions that are, sort of driving out other plant species in this context. This is of interest to us as ecologists, but I would argue it also has practical significance. If an invasive species is a driver, then when we control the invader, we should see some native recovery as a response. In contrast, if a species is a passenger, invader control alone might be insufficient for native recovery, as in that dandelion example, and there'd be other limits to identify and address. Now, this doesn't mean that there aren't other valid reasons to control aquatic invasive plants. I'm just approaching this from the lens of effects on native aquatic plants. And it's also the case that even if they weren't the original sort of drivers of change, their removal can become a necessary component of restoration. It's been described that they can be backseat drivers, so to speak, to extend the metaphor. But we need to set realistic goals for the benefits of control and understand if removing an invader really will lead to a restoration or recovery of native species, or maybe it will simply reduce the invader. So we spent a lot of time wrestling with these issues and kind of trying to squeeze information that we can apply to management from the data. And so this will be sort of an outline for the rest of my talk, a few vignettes about these different issues. So I'll talk about native plant diversity and invasion. I'll talk about competition for ecological niches, the effectiveness of different control efforts, and I'll end with how you can get involved. And you'll see that data also plays a key piece there in citizen science. So the backdrop, though, for all of this is the goal of conserving and restoring native aquatic vegetation. We want to see fewer situations like this on the landscape where we have degraded plant communities with invasive species dominance, and more situations like this where we have native diversity and the benefits that provides to people and nature. All right, so moving into native diversity and invasion, this is work led by Ranjit Muthukrishnan, who's now on the faculty at Boston University. And we looked at statewide trends in invasions and native plant diversity in Minnesota lakes. Oops, my animation got a little messed up there. I want to highlight the Minnesota DNR Shallow Lakes Program, who are collaborators on this, and they do great work statewide in management and monitoring of these shallow lakes. And that enabled us to look at trends in over 1,000 lakes in a period of more than a decade. So what did we find? First, we found that the most diverse lakes were the most vulnerable. That is, lakes with more native species were invaded more. So looking at this figure on the x-axis here, we have the species richness of the lake. That's simply the number of native species in this case. And then on the y-axis, we have the number of invasive species. And you can see there's a positive correlation there. That's often seen across terrestrial and aquatic communities. It's been described as the rich get richer. And it's simply the case that the environmental conditions and other factors that make these habitats support high native diversity, non-native species can also enjoy those resources. But it's a conservation concern because it means that the habitats that might have the greatest biodiversity value are often most likely to get invaded. However, this is not the scale at which plants are competing with each other. Within their lifetimes, plants aren't mobile. So when we think about competition between plants, it's really just their sort of immediate neighbors at a smaller scale. So that's the next thing I'll talk about, is those local interactions. When people perform these surveys, they go out to a grid of points across a lake, and they use a metal rake to see what plants are there. That's called a point intercept survey, and data from point intercept surveys will show up throughout my talk. And we were able to use repeated sampling data from the DNR where they'd gone out to those same points multiple years. And so we could see, you know, what happened when an invasive species arrived, how did things change over time? Unfortunately, we found these local interactions were a lose-lose for native plants. So the first thing we looked for is a phenomenon called biotic resistance. That's the idea that if you have more native species, that habitat might be sort of more packed, less space available for invasive species to come in. It would look something like this red line, where as we had higher richness, it was less likely to be invaded. However, we saw no evidence for that in these data. So native diversity did not prevent invasion. The next thing we looked at is a concept called competitive exclusion. And that's the idea that after an invader comes in, you'll see a decrease in native species. And unfortunately, that was the case. We found that invasion reduced native diversity over time. So a double whammy for our native aquatic plants. I've been talking about these plants in a pretty generic way, not getting into their biology and just sort of counting numbers of species, but it's really important to think of the ecology of these species. And here, the concept of the ecological niche comes into play. And those are just the different ways that species sort of make a living. We can see this in this cartoon here of different types of aquatic plants, where plants have adapted to fill different water depth niches in terms of their growth form. Or to use maybe a non-ecological example, if species are trying to occupy the same niche, they're more likely to compete. So, you know, in the cola wars, Pepsi and Coke are both trying to dominate the brown pop space because they're sort of trying to do the same thing. Whereas something like kombucha has become very popular. It's, you know, a growth in the beverage space, but it's not trying to compete in the same way. It's occupying a different niche in our marketplaces. So I'm going to delve into this with two species that we focus a lot of attention on in our lakes and a lot of management effort. Eurasian water milfoil, it's been here for about since the 1980s. It's in over 400 lakes, and as we saw before, it can form the surface matting nuisance. Curly-leaf pondweed is an invasive that's been around longer. It's in a lot more lakes. And people have noted that it grows earlier in the spring, and it also seems to tolerate lower light levels. And those two features suggest that maybe it's doing something different than a lot of other plant species in terms of the niche it's going after. So this is something that Mike Verhoeven, who's wrapping up his PhD, has been working on. And Mike made the prediction that curly-leaf pondweed might be less of a threat to native plants than Eurasian water milfoil, if it maybe has a lower niche overlap. So he compiled this really awesome data set from agencies, consultants, lake associations, and other partners around the state. Gave us years of data from over 1,500 lakes, over 3,000 individual surveys. And in these surveys, as I mentioned, people go out and sample these individual points. And in this case, over 350,000 points were sampled. And across those points, there were more than 550,000 observations of different native and invasive species. And this is really a treasure trove. If you factor in the cost, typical cost of one of these surveys, this is over $10 million of data that we're sort of living in different file cabinets and that Mike pulled together and has made available for our research as well as other researchers and lake managers. So I'm going to show some figures, and we're going to see curly-leaf pondweed in black, Eurasian water milfoil in red, and 32 common native plant species in gray. These figures are a little complicated, so I'll just walk through each one from top to bottom, starting with the light niche that these species are occupying. So light availability is a really big deal for plants growing in water. What we see is that curly-leaf pondweed here on the left end at low light availability, that's where you see a lot of the curly-leaf. So it is occupying darker areas than other invasive as well as native species. It's also growing deeper. Here we're looking at water depth, and you can see curly leaf is shifted to the right. And it's growing earlier. Growing degree days is sort of a measure of accumulation of heat over time during the growing season. You can think of this as going from the start of spring through the growing season, and you can see this earlier shift. So curly leaf pondweed is doing something different. It's growing in areas that are darker, deeper, and earlier in the season. And this is something Mike has followed up on with experimental work to really get at causality, and you'll be hearing more from him in the future about that. I'm going to shift gears and talk about management, and I'm going to contrast the capabilities that we have with curly leaf pondweed, which has been the subject of decades of management research and practice, with Starry Stonewort, which was first found in Minnesota in 2015 and has been subject to about a decade of control efforts across the Midwest. And the first published studies have only appeared recently, where we're really looking at the data to see what's working or not. And then as I said, we'll contrast that with curly leaf pondweed management. And again, I'm going to bring up work by Mike Verhoeven. He assembled 10 years of monitoring data collected by 12 different organizations that gave us insights into 50 different study lakes across the state. And what Mike found, among other things, is strong effects of sustained control efforts. So when people are treating, in this case with herbicides, year over year, you see this reduction in the lake-wide extent of curly leaf pondweed. So frequency of occurrence is essentially what proportion of the vegetated part of a lake do you find a species. And you can see as you keep at it, you're not eradicating the curly leaf pondweed, you won't do that, but you can really shrink that population back. So what do we see with Starry Stonewort? This is work led by Wes Glisson, who just became the aquatic botanist for the state of Washington. And we partnered with folks out at Lake Coronis in Stearns County, the first known Starry Stonewort lake in Minnesota. And there have now been years of well-monitored control efforts going back to 2015, an ambitious management program spearheaded by the Coronis Lake Association, as well as monitoring from consultants hired by Coronis Lake Association, as well as Minnesota DNR specialists. So we assembled that data and looked at changes in Starry Stonewort, in this case biomass, over time. And really importantly, they have been monitoring untreated reference areas, areas where there's been no attempts at control. And you can see there alone, there's a lot of variability, and this is on a log scale here on the y-axis. So this is even more change than it might immediately look like. So it's really important to have that sort of baseline to compare to when we look at the effectiveness of treatments. And when we do, we see some really tremendous reductions in biomass of this species using copper-based algicides, as well as mechanical control using a harvester. So we see big declines. Now, Starry Stonewort is not being eliminated from these areas, but it's being knocked way back in terms of its biomass. So that's a encouraging example. But we wanted to broaden out and see what these typical control efforts look like across broader scales of time and space. So we have done now a 3-state analysis. And I'm about to show you some data here where we look at before treatment and after treatment, again, using frequency of occurrence data. And now we've got a little cartoon lake showing what this looks like, the underlying data. You have a grid of points that are sampled. And here we've got stars showing where Starry Stonewort might have been found. And what we'd like to see is the frequency of occurrence decline with treatment. Unfortunately, we don't. We see no significant change at looking at things at this broader scale. And so we're not at the same place with Starry Stonewort that we've gotten to with curly leaf pondweed. There's a lot more to do in terms of the research and the experimentation to improve the tools that are available to us. So given those limitations in our ability to control this species, it's all the more important that we support early detection. And I'm going to illustrate that with Grand Lake, also in Stearns County, where Starry Stonewort was found in a small area by a public access back in 2017 through a citizen science event called Starry Trek that I'll explain in a moment. There have been multiple handfuls annually since then. Minnesota DNR staff have gone out and dived and pulled Starry Stonewort, and the Grand Lake Association has worked to monitor and contain this infestation. When we look at the data, we see a really nice signal of effectiveness of this hand pulling approach. So this is the biomass removed with the first pull, and then the Starry Stonewort has come back, but they pulled it and brought it back down. And if I had 2020 and 2021, it would look similar. So this is while it hasn't been eradicated, it's been contained and its impacts have been minimized. And that's been done without algicides because this population was found when it was small. So we have a lot more opportunities for effective management, as Roger described. So how can you get involved? Starry Trek is coming up Saturday, August 20th. I put the link there and I'll drop it in the chat after my presentation. It's a statewide single-day volunteer search effort. We have 20+ meetups around the state where local coordinators train and manage participants. And there's a sister program in Wisconsin from UW Extension called AIS Snapshot Day. And here in Minnesota, we partner with the DNR on this. We use data for this type of surveillance. Runjin, who I mentioned before, developed a risk model for Starry Stonewort based on water chemistry. And then we also draw on another form of data, which is the kind of on the ground expertise of our local coordinators who really know these lakes far better than we can from here in the Twin Cities. We've had a very high volunteer turnout of over 200 people per year that's allowed us to search over 200 lakes a year and close to 300 public accesses. And this has had an appreciable effect on our ability to find Starry Stonewort and hopefully find it earlier than we would otherwise. So this is showing the known lakes with Starry Stonewort in the state and the year when they were found. And in orange, I've highlighted the ones where Starry Trek volunteers were responsible for the discoveries. Along with Megan Weber and Pat Mulcahy, that's our core AIS extension team. Our main program is called AIS Detectors. That's what this work all began with. And we have an online and in-person curriculum where we've now trained over 400 certified detectors. And those are both community members who contribute valuable volunteer service, as well as professionals who participate in this training, folks like county level AIS staff. And then the last thing I'll mention is our newer program called AIS Management 101. A lot of aquatic plant and AIS management in the state it's sort of decentralized. It's largely driven by the efforts of lake associations. And so we're tasking predominantly non-professionals with making these important and sometimes scientifically challenging management decisions. So we wanted to develop a program to help educate these folks so they could feel more confident in understanding these systems and deciding what to do. And Megan led a nice paper that was recently published about this effort. We call it Creating Informed Consumers. And this figure is showing the gains in understanding that participants reported in terms of understanding things like regulations, pesticides, and how to monitor for management effectiveness. All right, thank you. And I will stop sharing, and if there's time and questions, take those.
Yes, thanks, Dan. Appreciate it. We have one question here, and another one's coming in. I'll ask the first one. Do algicides impact all aquatic plant species? And if so, are there other alternatives for chemical control?
Yeah, good question. So copper is actually one of humanity's oldest pesticides, and it's not just an algicide, it's a herbicide, fungicide, molluscicide. So there are potentially broad non-target impacts of copper. That's something Nick Phelps has a PhD student, Angelique Dahlberg, who's looking into the ecotoxicological effects of copper algicides. And that's something that I think needs some attention. These copper algicides are used for things like Starry Stonewort control, but they're also used for swimmer's itch, nuisance algae, and other things. And so I think what I think about the most in terms of species that might be impacted are native relatives of the Starry Stonewort that might be susceptible to use of copper. There are also herbicides that are used, often in combination with algicides, and then there are physical removal methods. I mentioned hand pulling, there's mechanical harvesting, and then there's also what's called diver-assisted suction harvesting. So there are multiple approaches available, but overwhelmingly, these control efforts have, across the Midwest, have used copper-based algicides.
Okay. The next question we have is, what do you find is the largest gap between scientists and public entities who are stakeholders in the health of lakes?
Ooh, public entities that are stakeholders. So that could kind of run the gamut. I think we want a lot of things from our lakes, and this is not necessarily scientists versus public entities. This is just stakeholders in general. I've emphasized sort of their ecological value. Obviously, people love to fish on lakes. They like to water ski. They like to live by them. Water quality is important. So there are many different objectives, if you will, different things that people value from lakes. And sometimes there can be competing interests where, what I might prioritize as somebody who thinks a lot about biodiversity or has concerns about AIS. I might have different priorities for how we should conserve and manage lakes than somebody who, is prioritizing forms of recreation. So I think just that we have such vested interests in our lakes is a wonderful thing about the state of Minnesota, and has enabled, creation of MAISRC and has funded a lot of important AIS work, but it also means that there are very diverse viewpoints and stakeholder interests, and we need to find effective ways to bring a lot of people to the table to work through these challenges.
All right, we have another question that came in. What are the best plants to grow along the Mississippi River shoreline to control erosion and to buffer adjacent wetlands?
Yeah, great question. I think anything you can do to soften and naturalize shorelines is great. So grass is, turf grass is better than riprap, and native prairie plantings are better than turf grass. It's not necessarily the plants themselves, but what we do to manage them. So reducing use of fertilizers and herbicides is really important. And, there's been a lot of work on shoreline plantings and in the past incentive programs for shoreline property owners. And so I think if you can bring sort of a prairie fringe to your yard along that shoreline as it transitions into wetland, it adds, beauty and aesthetics and pollinators, and then it can also provide some water quality benefits and protection for that emergent and aquatic vegetation.
All right, and we have another question. It says AIS Management 101. Why not have this available broadly online for free? Greatly expand the number of people with this knowledge.
Absolutely. It is available online, and we now have it's available free to anyone, actually. So we have switched from asking people to apply for reduced cost to at registration, making reduced cost up to free available for people as they register. So anybody can take this course, and if cost is a limitation, you can take it for $0. So that was precisely one of our goals with this program, and people are taking it, from all over the country. So it's, that's one of the advantages as we've, these virtual technologies have enabled us to really broaden participation.
Another question is, do the volunteers work on stormwater management ponds or only on natural bodies of water?
Good question. I can't think of stormwater pond examples off the top of my head. We have a big tent when we think of what constitutes AIS volunteer work. So if there is a connection to aquatic invasive species, then absolutely. So, and there are a lot of AIS and stormwater ponds, curly leaf pondweed, invasive Phragmites, like Roger mentioned, hybrid cattail. So yeah, absolutely working stormwater would be relevant.
Another one is, what data do you have for shallow lakes less than 15 to 20 feet deep?
Yeah, that's a lot of the data. So that analysis by Rungen, where I showed the kind of relationships between native and invasive species, was from the Shallow Lakes program of the Minnesota DNR. So that was all shallow lakes data. And then the other research examples I gave often included shallow lakes data, but then broadened out to deeper lakes as well.
I got one final question here, Dan, and I think it goes back to the first questions about copper. And it says, are there issues with fish, and parenthetically, and danger to humans when eating fish, and the copper and or other herbicides in the treatment?
Yeah, that's a question we get a lot. So fish are a concern with copper, and there are fish biologists who are very concerned about potential detrimental impacts to fish from copper. The human impacts, it gets real complicated to assess because those are difficult questions to test, whether things we're adding to lakes like herbicides are impacting humans. There's a lot of testing that goes into approval and permitting of aquatic pesticides. And so, there's examination and testing to make sure there aren't acute effects, but it's another question to think about if somebody is living on the shore of a lake that's being managed and they're doing it for decades and they're exposed to various compounds over time that could potentially have, subtler chronic effects and synergistic effects between different toxins. So that's just sort of an unfortunate reality for people in general in this day and age, not just with aquatic pesticides, but with all the different compounds that we're exposed to in our lifetimes. And I think probably a lot of you can relate. It seems like every couple of years, there's a new thing to worry about, a plastic or a liner or something that we hadn't heard about before. So it's a good question, and one that I know there's a lot of concern about. And I think highlights the importance of investing in ecotoxicological research, which has sort of dwindled over the past several decades, unfortunately.
All right, I think we're going to stop there, Dan. Great questions, everybody. Great interactions. Just as a reminder that this conference is being recorded, and you'll find out in the days to come how you can access those recordings and the presentations that were given by each keynote speaker. So I think we'll move on to our final keynote for this morning. Dr. Rebecca Montgomery. She's a professor in the Department of Forest Resources and fellow in the University of Minnesota's Institute on the Environment. Dr. Montgomery's research focuses on understanding the role of plant functional traits in plant ecology and response to global change. She's interested in understanding how plants interact with and respond to their environments and the implications of these responses for forest dynamics, forest management, biodiversity, and ecosystem function. This broad scope allows for better understanding of the effects of global climate change on terrestrial ecosystems, ecology of forest understories, mechanisms of species interactions in forest ecosystems, and the ecology of managed forest systems. Welcome, Dr. Montgomery.
Thanks so much. Let me get my screen sharing going here. Does that look okay for those of you who are are able to speak up. Full screen, we're all good?
Looks good.
Looks
Great.
great.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conference today. I'm going to talk today about phenology, community, citizen science, and how we can use these both to improve management of invasive plants. I want to acknowledge that I have a number of collaborators from a number of different agencies, as well as national organizations associated with monitoring seasonal timing, and also that funding for the work that I'm going to show and talk about was provided by MITPPC and the Environmental and Natural Resource Trust Fund. I need to start with a word and a definition because it's going to show up a lot in my talk. That word is phenology. Phenology comes from the Greek word phanos, which means to show or to appear. And it's the study of these recurring life cycle events of plants and animals, like bird migration, tree leafing, flowering and fruiting. And if you are in the Grand Rapids, Northwoods area where I am right now, you may be familiar with this term because of the wonderful community radio station KXE that has a fantastic person, John Latimer, who has a phenology show, and it spreads the word throughout the Northland of why phenology is awesome and cool. I'm going to use this seasonal life cycle timing to really touch on the themes that Vince mentioned at the start, thinking about what makes species invasive, what makes management effective, how we can incorporate community science. And so the roadmap of my talk is really going to start out with thinking about why does phenology matter in terms of invasive species, and then a case study where we're following phenology of two of the kind of high priority invasive plant species in the state, and then closing with a bit on the role of community science and how it contributes to the work that we're doing. So I'm going to start with an example from common or European buckthorn in terms of how phenology is important for thinking about why this plant is successful. And one of the things that, if you know this species, you may have noticed is that in the spring or in the fall, as shown in this picture, as most of our native trees and plants around it are senescing and dropping their leaves, buckthorn maintains them. And similarly in the spring, before that canopy leafs out and makes it very shady in the understory, buckthorn has leaves and is really taking advantage of that early season highlight period. And this contributes to its success. And well, some years ago in my lab, I had a master's student who did a project that wanted to understand how important might these early spring and late fall times where these buckthorn has its leaves out and it has lots of light to photosynthesize for its growth and as a proxy of its success. And so what we did is we went out and we basically put shade structures over the buckthorn and said, ha ha, you are not going to get this bright light in the spring. We're gonna keep that from you. We're gonna pretend maybe you're leafing out after the canopy leaves out, like many other species in the understory, and see what happens in terms of your growth. And what we found is that our unshaded plants had 4 times more growth than those that were shaded. So really good evidence that this just short period, sometimes just 10 days in the spring, can play a really important role in terms of growth. And this work was part of the seed that led to a MITPPC funded project called Covered Up that's looking at how can we use the early leafing species as natural controls on buckthorn in our forest ecosystems. So an example of how phenology is important in the success of this particular species, and this is the case in a number of forest invasive species, that this seasonal timing is important in their success. Seasonal timing is also important in terms of scheduling management. And this is not an invasive species example, but we sweep streets when all the leaves are down. It makes it more effective because we're trying to remove those leaves. So the seasonal timing of the plants are critical for that particular management. And this is true for invasive species as well. This is a beautiful life cycle graphic from the MDA for spotted knapweed, showing the life cycle from seed all the way through growth and flowering and creating more seeds. And along the way, indications of when to apply different management treatments. And so at different life stages, different treatments are suggested, and even not treating is suggested in particular timing. So phenology is critical in terms of the application of our management and the effectiveness of that management. Invasive species plant management depends on timing. And with that kind of background in terms of kind of a short intro to phenology, I want to introduce and talk about a particular case study called Pesky Plant Trackers, in which we're specifically looking at timing and phenology as a way to schedule and be more effective at managing two invasive plants. Our two focal plants, our first one is wild parsnip. This is a species of disturbed and open areas. It occurs along roadsides and can invade old fields. It's this yellow thing here. It's problematic both because of its density, but often and more because of its human health impacts. This is a species that if you break the stem and you get sap from that stem on your skin and your skin is exposed to the sun, you will get a chemical burn. So it can cause these chemical burns, and thus is a real danger to have in workspaces like fields and roadsides, and even the management of it can pose risks if you don't have the proper protective clothing. This is the life cycle of wild parsnip. It's a biennial, so it forms a rosette in its first year, and then in the second year that rosette bolts, flowers, and then seeds and starts the cycle again. The most effective and the most common management is mowing, and the phenology is really critical to the effectiveness of that mowing. If you mow when the plant is flowering, in this phase here, that basically removes those flower heads before they can produce seed, and effectively slows and reduces the spread. If you mow once there are seeds, you are actually exacerbating the problem and creating more spread. If you mow too early, the plant resprouts, rebolts, and flowers are produced. Our second species is Japanese knotweed. This is a species that forms very, very dense thickets, highly shaded, and where it becomes abundant, there's not a lot of other species, so reducing biodiversity. But this species is also a problem because its rhizomes, its underground stems, can move through the soil and actually can penetrate and move through bricks and concrete and cause problems with like actual buildings and structures. And this in part comes from its history. It's a species that's native to areas that have active volcano activity, and it comes in and colonizes those new lava flows, and is able to sort of break through the lava and start that process of succession and breakdown in soil. This is a perennial plant, and so it resprouts every year, bolting stems, flowers, in some cases seeds, not always, and then dies back and does it again. This species can reproduce by just little chunks of these below ground stems, by fragments of the above ground plant, and by seeds. So the high risk of spread of this species, because just small pieces of the plant will move elsewhere. And again, you'll see here that clipping and spraying are recommended at particular life cycle times, whereas other control is recommended in other times. So again, this kind of coupling of management to timing of phenology is critical for this species. Generally, for these species and for most control efforts, we use calendar dates. The Department of Transportation has this really wonderful resource that lays out some of these life cycle and treatment effects, and then has kind of these calendars of recommended activity during particular windows. But the problem with calendar dates is that these life cycle events like phenology are really, they don't always occur at the same time, because they're determined by things like temperature. And if it's a colder or a warmer year, these phases progress more quickly or more slowly. Similarly, precipitation can potentially affect it. And so wetter versus drier years may alter the timing of phenology. And then in some cases, both of these interact with things like day length to determine the timing. And so our project really asks, can we improve the timing of management if we use climate to predict phenology? So rather than saying, oh, we're going to be in this phase in June, and in some point in June, we need to go out and do mowing. What if we could use widely distributed weather data, integrate that with phenology data to predict the timing, and then schedule our mowing, our management for these species? And weather data is pretty widely available, easily accessible, downloadable. Phenology, less so. And this is important. These kind of integration is important because not only does weather vary from year to year with warm years, cold years, wet years, dry years, but our climate is changing and we are shifting, which means that these phenology, the timing is likely to shift. And being able to predict those shifts can help us schedule the management for when it's most effective. To do this, we need phenology data, which is not widely available. And so our project really set out to collect phenology data and build these climate-based models to predict timing for these two species. Our project's called Pesky Plant Trackers, and it is a community science project. So much of the data that we are using in this work is collected by community members. Those members go through a training program. We have both online kind of self-guided training, and then we have offered Zoom trainings because this whole project began during the COVID era. And those volunteers, once they're trained, can participate in a couple of different ways. They can track phenology in existing infestations. So if there's not weed patch near your home or wild parsnip on a roadside near you, or if you're interested in participating, we work to find locations near you where you can collect data, or volunteers track phenology at gardens that are planted at 5 of the research and outreach centers, including here in Grand Rapids. And if anyone is in the Grand Rapids area and is coming today for the in-person part of our program, we will be visiting the Grand Rapids garden that has knotweed and parsnip in it, and talking more about kind of what volunteers do and what kind of data we collect and about these plants. And so once we have those data, we couple the data with temperature data, with data on day length to build these models. And so here's my one data slide for you all as an example of one of these models. And Dan brought up and talked a little bit about growing degree days. So on this axis here, we have growing degree days. So this is really how much warmth this Japanese knotweed plant has experienced in the springtime, and over time, warmth accumulates. So we can think about this as going, earlier to later season. And then on this axis, we have how many of our plants have completed this phenophase, have emerged out of the ground from dormancy and started to grow. And you see that over time, more and more and more of our individuals, until eventually at a particular amount of warmth, all of the plants have emerged. And so from this, we can basically predict, okay, at what amount of warmth will 50% or 70% of Japanese knotweeds be in this phenophase? And we can build a mathematical model that then we can use to predict. So we can pull weather, look at weather forecasts and say, when are we going to hit this critical threshold when most of the plants will be in this phase? And that would trigger then, this is when we want to schedule our management. In this case, initial growth is not the time, but that's the figure I had. But say for our parsnip, that flowering phase, but not yet fruiting, we want to know more or less what week the majority of plants are going to be in that, so we can go out and schedule management. And that's what this kind of data modeling approach allows us to do. So with that kind of background on why we care about phenology, a little case study about how we're kind of using phenology and community science and data to make predictions that improve management of species. I want to close with a discussion of really the role that our community or citizen science or participatory scientists play in the work that we do. And I think the example here applies across other projects that you've heard about today, and their role in general. So I'm one person. I have three other staff people working on this project. So we're 3 people that can collect data. And so one of the things that community science does is expands the number of people and the spatial coverage from which we can collect data. I live in Falcon Heights. There's a knotweed in my backyard. There's a knotweed on the path I walk my dog. So that's 2 plants that I could potentially monitor. There's not much parsnip anywhere near where I am. So our community science partners really allow us to look across a much broader area. In Minnesota, we have 94 sites that are being monitored. This is actually a national program supported by the USA National Phenology Network. So we have 43 sites outside of Minnesota. And these are a mix of wild parsnip and knotweed. So that spatial scope, which actually allows us to cover more area, more different types of environments, more climate gradients, which gives us more data with which we can address the questions that we have. The other thing we get, and this might be this might be more specific to phenology than other type of community science, but I saw a question in here about kind of best practices. And also, I know a lot of people are critical, like how good is community science and citizen science? And this example that I'm going to walk you through really shows us that our data from our community scientists actually increases the kind of accuracy and precision of our estimates, because they can collect data more frequently. So this kind of cartoon shows you is comparing our expert observer, in this case, Chris, with citizens. And this was a leaf fall project related to street sweeping. And so Chris, because of other commitments, could only monitor phenology once a week. So he would go on Mondays and he'd say, are the leaves falling or not? Well, on this Monday, the leaves were not falling. He comes back the next week later, yes, they are falling. Well, what day did leaf fall start? It could have started any one of these days. It could have started Tuesday, the day after he went out, or it could have started the day he arrived. So anywhere within this window. So we know that our estimate happened sometime in those 7 days. So really our kind of accuracy, our ability to predict is 3.5 days. Contrast that with our citizen scientists. We had many of them were dog walkers, or they had trees in their front yards. And so we had a number of different people, which meant there were observations every day on these trees. And when we have observations every day, we see that in this case, we had no on Friday, and then Saturday it was yes. So we actually know the exact day that this transition occurred. And so we have kind of much more precise data when we bring in multiple volunteers. And this is actually true in the Pesky Plants Trackers program, where our experts can visit maybe once a week, and some sites people can only visit once a week. And then other sites, we have enough volunteers that people are going every day and the plants are getting monitored every day. So increasing that temporal resolution is just a critical and important aspect that our community scientists provide. The last quick 2 examples of contributions is, we've put surprise generosity. We were looking for parsnip seeds, and our volunteers collected seeds from their parsnip for us that we then used for our growth chamber experiments back on the campus. So this generosity of support and for our work beyond just the data collection that the volunteers were doing. And then this eyes and cameras on the ground. Our volunteers have been just amazing in terms of being able to contribute to our database of photos, to our community of discussions of what people are seeing where, and kind of supporting learning about the variation and diversity in the plants and the phenology of these plants that we're working on. So to close, phenology is critical to basic biology of invasive species. It is critical to successful and effective management, and our community participatory citizen scientists, I think, are critical to the data and new insights that we are gaining on these. And with that, I tell you, spread the word, not the seeds, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Rebecca. There's a little bit of a lag I've noticed in questions coming in, so I'm just gonna give it a few seconds for if anybody who wants to ask a question of Dr. Montgomery, please enter that now. One of the questions I had, Rebecca, was, can you point to the most successful community scientist kind of collaboration that you've had with a project? And when you think about other efforts in other species that you've worked with, what made that particular project especially successful? What was unique about that relationship that really benefited the data collection and the strategies that ultimately came out of the data?
Yeah, so I would actually say that this pesky plants is probably my most successful collaboration on this. I had worked on sort of broad phenology projects before thinking about climate change. And one of the things that I think has made pesky plants very successful, and this will be no surprise to folks working on this, and Angie will probably be rolling her eyes over there, but having a coordinator who is like the communicating and engaging and creating community among the volunteers, answering questions, hosting. We host depends on the season, but it can be weekly or monthly Tea Tuesdays, where we actually use Zoom and the technology to bring anyone together to just come together and talk about what they're seeing, questions they have, to answer questions. Sometimes we have folks come in and share, say, what we're doing with the data, or we have actually collaborators in Vermont who are we have Pesky Plant Trackers Vermont happening, so connecting across those. We have a newsletter, and I feel like I had never had a staff person that really was 100% working on that volunteer engagement piece. And I think that is critical, that just asking people to participate and collect data, you want them to be excited and interested in learning and participating and answering their own questions, but they also want to know that they're part of a bigger thing and be getting that feedback and interaction with the research team and with other volunteers to really make that rich experience. And actually, Angie, if you wanted to jump in and you have worked on many more of these projects than I have, so I would invite you to maybe jump in and answer as well, if you are there, Angie.
Yeah, I'm here. I was busy typing, so trying to go back and remember what the question was. But I agree with you, right? So from an organizational perspective, good volunteer management, good adult education, principles of adult education engagement are very, very important to successful projects. As I have done more projects that really run the gamut from what I view to be crowdsourcing to much more engaged participatory science, I think it does open up a lot of possibilities. So some of the crowdsourcing, it's kind of catch as catch can. It's really online, simple education. It's not intensive engagement of volunteers. The flip side to that is it's hard to go back and revisit or engage with those volunteers because you might only have an iNaturalist login. Right? I mean, that's the extent of your engagement. But my point here is that I think there are many, many ways in which participatory science can happen, and we can answer a lot of amazing and critical questions using that full gamut of opportunities. And I think we should explore those, but inevitably it takes some level of program management, right? I mean, they all do without a doubt. And I will say, when you said Angie's probably rolling her eyes, I totally did, right? Because in my opinion, that is the piece that often doesn't get the funding. Right? It's much easier to access large grants around the research, but not around the management of the people. Yet the two cannot be done without that, particularly when you engage community members. So I'll go back to typing and finish. It'll be in the chat here in a moment, but thanks for pitching it over.
Yeah, thank you, Angie.
Thanks, Angie. And I have a few more questions, Rebecca. One is, are any cities that you know of working to control garlic mustard around stormwater retention ponds?
Roger. Roger's the garlic mustard person.
I know.
So I'm going to just pitch it his way.
We can come back to Roger. Let's circle back to Roger, but I wanted to touch a couple other ones here. Do you collect absence data too?
Absolutely. So absence data, meaning like not happening phenophases. I'm gonna interpret that in terms of what we do, because we find, and our volunteers find an individual plant, and then they follow that plant. They revisit the same plant over and over. They build a relationship with the pesky plant. And that not happening data is critical, because you can't know when something starts if you don't know that it wasn't happening before. So having that no, it's not flowering, yes, it's flowering, yes, it's flowering, now no, it's not, is absolutely critical, because that's how you get, when does it start, when does it end, how long does it flower? So if that was kind of the intent of absence data, yes.
Okay. Another question is, when encountering invasives that have already turned to seed, is there anything that could be done, or should we just leave it be and perhaps go back and pull it in the fall?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would refer people to specific species and you know, the resources that are out there. If you are encountering a particular invasive species, the resources out there really depend on each species and what are the different risk factors and the best control methods at the various times. So for example, wild parsnip, I might say if you see it with seeds, maybe don't pick it up and throw it in your car and drive somewhere else and then throw it away, because all along the way you might be dropping seeds. You know, and that transportation of it is problematic, because there can be loss along the way, and that's how spread happens. And if you leave it, it will seed in place, it'll stay where it is, and you could potentially then go back or tag it in ed maps. I mean, there's an app that when you encounter invasive species, that you can report it, and then an expert will go out and assess the infestation, make sure it's the species you think it is, and get it on kind of the radar for control by folks who are experts in the control. I don't know if anyone else on the panel wants to add to that.
We have a few more questions. One is, have you studied when to cut down the pesky tansy plant? Duluth has so much of this troublesome weed, it's in disturbed soils in the region.
No. I've worked on the two that I presented here. And then I have worked with buckthorns and honeysuckles. So I don't have experience with tansy. Angie, you're unmuted. Do you want to talk about tansy?
Oh, I dropped in the, I think a reasonable answer to that question in the Q&A, so people can look there. But this is my actual shout out to the great invasive plant data control database. I've dropped it in as a response to 2 different questions. And so the link is already there, but I just want to point out that that database, it does not have every terrestrial invasive plant in the world for sure, but it does have some very common ones. And you can go in there and you can identify whether you're a novice user or you are a more experienced person with that plant, what type of habitat, aquatic, forest, pasture, prairie, right-of-way, riparian, what season you're working, and the effectiveness. And then you can put all that in with your species, and it will give you a whole bunch of things that a lot of people have tried and how it's worked, and if it's researched, and the link can be in there. There are also some case studies. I know there's one related to goats and buckthorn. So this is just a shout out to go ahead and look in closely to that invasive plant control database. It's got a lot of super great information. Thanks.
Thanks, Angie. Another question, Rebecca, is how far out would you expect a model to be able to predict so you can schedule working it on invasive species in advance?
Yeah, we are still in the process of developing the models, but we're US Pest.org, which is where we're going to basically serve them from. They using the kind of trajectory of growing degree days, coupling with your models, usually the management scheduling can be, 2-3 weeks to a month in advance, projecting ahead.
Okay. We have one last question, and it says, is buckthorn management effective if seeds are on the plant but not ripened? I want to let plant put energy into effort and stop it without finishing cycle for seed growth. Too large of an area to spray or mechanically review totally.
Yeah, the problem with buckthorn is resprouting, and even with spraying herbicides, you can resprout. So I guess I would be more worried about the kind of follow-up. After a treatment of an area. If the seeds aren't ripened, they're not ripe. So are you talking about, can you cut it down and not spread the seeds? I think that the plants have a lot of stored carbohydrates. And so I think giving it a couple weeks just to move the seeds further along won't make a huge dent in those carbohydrates. So I'm not sure that you need to wait. And oftentimes for plants that have stored carbohydrates and resprout, it's actually hitting them multiple times. So a single removal, even though it might be effective for resprout in a particular year, it's going to resprout the following year. And so actually kind of repeated depletion is needed for many of these that are going to resprout because of that kind of those carbohydrate, those energies that are stored that fuel that. I'm not sure that I fully answered that or answered that to your
I think that concludes the questions for this morning. I want to take an opportunity to thank Rebecca and all of our speakers this morning, who I think provided a lot of really useful information and gave a great overview of invasives and the work that the University of Minnesota is doing in both research and outreach and community science, citizen science, training and empowerment. So thanks to all for great presentations. This brings me to just a final parting comments for you all, and that is that I hope that you found the morning that you spent with us time well spent, and that the information was beneficial to you in your particular situation and interest. Thanks so much to all of you for participating. And as I mentioned earlier, all the afternoon sessions, if you'll be participating in those at the local ROCs closest to where you live, will begin at 1 p.m. When at your Research and Outreach Center, I'd like to just invite you to take a moment to review some of the supporting printed material that you'll find on a table or location at the ROC in the administration buildings, and learn more about how you can receive a copy of your own. You'll be hearing from us soon via an email about a survey that will give us an opportunity to hear from you. Please take a few minutes to give us your feedback, as this will help us to improve on our programs that are developed and delivered to you in the future. As your host and lead coordinator, it was a pleasure to serve as your host this morning. Safe travels this afternoon to whatever ROC you are traveling to. And I just want to give a shout out to all the people that have been a part of this program, Liv Klemick, Dawn Seibert, and all the speakers this morning who contributed to this morning's program. So I wish you all the best, and I hope you have a wonderful afternoon at the ROC. Take care.